Hi everybody, and welcome to the fourth Racetrack Builder tutorial. This one is about how to make the racetrack wider and narrower. Now there are two parts of this. The first part is how to configure the curves in order to specify the width of the racetrack. The second part is how to configure your racetrack mesh templates so that you can tell Racetrack Builder how to stretch and squeeze your meshes so that the track type widens and narrows in an appropriate way. So we'll start with how to specify the width in the curves. So to start with, I've created a project. I've imported the Racetrack Builder package, and I've created a simple scene and added a basic plane for the ground plane. So I'm just going to go ahead and add a new 3D object racetrack, and I'll just pull it up a little bit. And I'm going to choose the Racetrack Mesh template from the higher res folder, and it's laned. I'm going to use laned poles barrier. I'm just going to drop that onto my curve. And this mesh template is called laned because it has lane markings painted into the main surface texture. However, you don't see them until you actually widen the road out. So basically when the road widens, it appears like there's multiple lanes. So this is a good example for widening and narrowing the road. So I'm just going to go ahead, I'll make this curve a bit longer. And I'll just add another curve. And I'll make that one a little bit shorter. Okay, so we want to change the width of the road, and we can do that with these two widening values. So if we want to change the left hand side, make it 12 units wider, you can just enter a 12 into there and update the curve. And there we go. So basically this value, much like the bank angle for example, this specifies how much wider it is at the end of the curve, and then Racetrack Builder will interpolate from the start of the curve, the value as at the start of the curve, to the end of the curve. So if we add another curve, much like the other values, it's going to copy that ahead to the next curve. So we'll make that one a little bit longer. And we'll add another short curve in there. And if I enter 12 on the right hand side box, it's going to make the right hand side wider. So now we effectively have a 3-lane road. And we can use the normal Racetrack Builder curve controls. If we want to curve the road around, the bank angle on it, maybe one on the previous part. And it pretty much behaves like, well, like the unwidened road really. Let's just straighten that out. Okay, so if we want to go back to the default width, add another curve in there. Make that a shorter one. And we could just enter 0 back into the widening values. And there we go. So it's worth keeping in mind that the widening values are added to the default width of the Racetrack Mesh template. You're not specifying the absolute width, you're just specifying how much wider or narrower it will be from the default one. So if it's set to 0, it's basically no change. So as well as making the racetrack wider, we can make it narrower. And that is simply done by entering a negative value into the widening. So we can put a -5 here, -5 there, and I might just shorten that again. And we have a narrower racetrack. Now the racetrack template have a minimum width built into them. So if we go and set that to -15, so we can see that it's narrowed it down a lot quicker, but once it's got down to the minimum width, it won't go any narrower than that. And that's specified when you configure the mesh template, which we'll see in a little bit. Okay, so there's a couple of things to take into consideration if you're widening the racetrack in particular. One of them is the polygons. We just switch to a wireframe mode. We just go back to the start. So here's the normal unwidened racetrack. And we can see it's got the polygons that have a particular density. When it widens the racetrack, you can see it's not actually creating any more vertices or polygons, it's just basically stretching the ones that it's already got. So that needs to be kept in mind, because when the racetrack is wider, the polygon density is lower basically, so this has an impact on how well they curve, how well they look. And it's the same thing for the actual mesh that you drive on, the collision mesh. You can see that it's stretched out horizontally. You compare it with the collision mesh of the unwidened road. You can see you've got a lot higher density. So it can mean that if you've got banked corners in particular, tight curves, the surface can be a bit rougher to look at and to drive on. So it's worth keeping that in mind if you're going to be using a lot of wide roads. You might want to consider creating some meshes with some extra Z-axis aligned loop cuts, for example, just to create some more polygons. Now the default mesh templates that come with Racetrack Builder have been pre-configured with information that tells them how to widen and to go narrower, but some of them work better than others. So generally the ones with repeating surface textures like asphalt, laned or metal plate work quite well. Wood planks is a little bit of a tricky one. The texture doesn't repeat horizontally because one side is slightly lighter than the other. So as the road widens, it actually just stretches it out horizontally, and depends on how noticeable you believe this is. The other one, old planks, this one really doesn't work very well at all. And that's just because the vertical plank textures, they just get stretched out and there's sort of waves and it just looks horrible. Okay, so now I want to move on to how to configure the racetrack mesh templates. And I've created a couple of mesh templates. We'll start with this one. It's just a simple laned road. Now this template was built from scratch from the meshes and just adding in the components that tell Racetrack Builder which ones are the continuous surfaces and the repeating pieces. This is the same as what is described in the second tutorial video. I've steered away from the prefabs for the individual pieces, just so that we don't pick up any configuration for how to widen the racetrack. So we want basically a clean mesh template so we can see what it does by default. I'm just going to unpack that. We will drag it onto our curve and update the track. Okay, so we can see that by default there's a few problems. Probably the most obvious one being the poles down the middle of the road. And we can see that Racetrack Builder is basically not moving the poles as the road widens. You can see the textures look a bit all over the place. And at the end of the racetrack, the part where it's supposed to go narrower, it simply hasn't gone narrower. If we switch to wireframe, we can see that the issue is that basically Racetrack Builder, when it's not given any hints, it simply moves everything to the left of the center line. When you widen it, it moves it left, and when you widen the right hand side, it just moves everything to the right of the center line to the right. And this is why we get these big stretched textures in the middle. And it also means the way that the polygons are laid out. Well, they're not laid out evenly, so you're unlikely to get the best surface to look at. Okay, so let's address the problem of poles to start with. And that's fairly simple. We just find the poles. Got this small pole in our track template. And it has this apply widening. We'll just tick that. And the other side, here it is. And we'll just update the track. Now, apply widening is something that applies to spaced components, and it basically tells Racetrack Builder whether they should move horizontally when the racetrack is widened or not. And we can see that once we switch it on, they get pushed out to the left and right, and they line up with the rails. So next up, we want to tell Racetrack Builder how to stretch our meshes out so that we can widen the road in a useful way. And we have a special component for that, and it's called Racetrack Widen Ranges. I'm just going to add it to the main object of the template. Now, widen range is basically two horizontal ranges. So each one has a left side and a right side, and we're basically specifying the horizontal ranges that can be stretched horizontally or squeezed horizontally. And our component, basically just has those values. It's got some lines so that you can visualize it, and it's got some drag handles to make it a bit easier. So let's set the range to cover the horizontal range of our mesh template. So it looks like it might be negative 2.4. That's about right. And we can just mirror it to the right. So I can get a sort of a picture of how it's going to stretch and squeeze. Let's just go and update our racetrack again. So let's have a look at our polygons. So you can see it's stretching them out a bit more evenly now. The texture looks slightly better, but it's still basically stretching it horizontally. So we're not getting parallel lanes like we want to. But we'll come back to that in a little bit. One of the issues we have is that the curb and the railings are getting magnified horizontally as well. What we probably want to do is just have the actual road surface stretching and keep the curb and the railings basically the same width, so they just move horizontally but they don't magnify horizontally, if you like. And we can see here that the road is basically, when it narrows down, it's narrowing all the way down to 0. So anyway, let's address the curb and the railings first. Let's go back to our template. And what we can do is we can move our widening ranges so that the curb and the railing sit outside it. Let's just move that over there. And that looks like -2. And again, we'll just mirror it to the right. Let's update our track. And now we can see that it's just stretched the middle part and it's left the outside railings and curb at the same width. So if we go and look at the end of the racetrack, which we've narrowed down, we can see now that it hasn't squashed the whole thing down to 0. It's left the left and right side of the curbs. However, it has narrowed down the driving surface, and that's because that's within the widening ranges. So that narrows all the way down to 0. We probably don't want it to go all the way to 0, so what we can do is we can specify a minimum width. So I'm going to set the left and right to 0.5. And we can probably get away with just updating from that curve onwards. Right. Okay, so the last thing we want to look at is the surface texture. And if we look at the wireframe, we can see what the issue is. And essentially it's widening the meshes by moving the vertices. So it moves the vertices in space, but it doesn't do anything with the texture coordinates. So basically the texture just gets stretched horizontally with the mesh. So we have a component that can help us with this. And this is called the Racetrack Uv Generator. And we basically add that to the object that has our mesh. But it's the one with the mesh renderer. It has to go on that one. So what this does is it generates texture coordinates based on the vertex position along the racetrack. So it takes the distance down the racetrack and the horizontal position on the racetrack before it's applied any of the curves. So to use it, we need to first specify the material that it's going to apply to. So I've got this materials array. There's no particular special editor on this, it's just using the standard Unity editor. So we need to first specify the number of elements. We just want to do 1. And then we have to tell it which material it's going to apply to. So the easiest way is I can go up here and click on Asphalt Painted, and then it's kind of found it in my project. So I can drag it over and drop it on there. Right, so I'm going to set the side to top and bottom. Basically Racetrack Builder won't update all the texture coordinates, it's just looking for the ones that look like the top surface or the bottom surface, depending on what you've chosen for the side. And this maximum angle is basically how close the polygon normal has to be to the up or down vector in order for it to be considered a top or a bottom facing polygon. So I've also got this scale, offset and rotation, and the one that we need to set is the scale. So if we enter 25 by 25, we're basically saying that one texture will be stretched to 25 units in world space. So let's start with that. Just update the track. And we can see that's quite improved. So the lane markings are nice and parallel. The text is not stretched horizontally anywhere. Still not quite there because the lane markings are still visible when the road hasn't been widened at all. And we can address this by setting the offset. Now the offset is in texture coordinates, so it should be between 0 and 1, although we're also allowed to go negative if that's more convenient. It's normally a bit of trial and error. I found that negative 0.015 seems to center this particular texture. And there we go. Now I can see that we haven't actually got it 100% right. You can still see the lane markings. I probably should have set the scale a little bit wider. But for the purposes of this tutorial, this should be fine. Okay, so for the last part of this tutorial, I have a slightly more complicated track template. I'm just going to drag this on here. Get rid of the other one. And this just illustrates some slightly more advanced things you may need to do if you've got a slightly more complicated racetrack mesh template. So I'm just going to go ahead and unpack it first, and then I'll drag it onto my curve. And once again, this mesh template has been built basically from scratch from the meshes. So it doesn't have any information to tell Racetrack Builder how to make it wider or narrower. So I can see straight away that this barrier down the middle is causing a bit of a problem. It's basically getting stretched out. So instead of just being a narrow rail, it's turned into this massive, rather strange looking thing. And once again, that is because without any extra information, Racetrack Builder is simply moving everything to the left. That is, to the left of the centerline left and to the right of the centerline right. So if you happen to have something that goes right down the middle, it's basically just going to get stretched out. So obviously that's not what we want. So let's just go ahead and add our widen ranges. Once again, we can drag them out into 2. So we've basically captured the main surface. We update the racetrack now. So we can see it's somewhat improved. But it is still magnifying this center barrier and this pole. So even though it's not stretching it out, like it's not the only thing that's being stretched, it still is being stretched itself. And that's not quite what we want. So once again we can go back to our mesh template. What we can do is, the widening ranges, they have a maximum horizontal value, but they also have a minimum. So we can take this minimum and drag it so that the barrier isn't included. Let's try 0.2. Looks like what we want. Just mirror that left. Once again, we'll update the racetrack. And it's starting to look a lot better. So once again we can see that the texture is being stretched. So let's just go ahead and do what we did before. Separate asphalt, add our UV generator, one material, find our asphalt, drag it on, do top and bottom again, and set the scale to perhaps 20 by 20. So the top of it is starting to look about right. Let's have a look at the bottom. So we have these poles, and they're basically spaced a certain width apart, and that width doesn't change. So let's go ahead and tick the apply widening tick box. For our left and right poles. We also have these beam cube objects which we want to move as well. Let's have a look at that. So we can see it's moved them, it's basically kept them moved all the way to the outside of our racetrack. I've just realised I haven't set a minimum width. Go ahead and put that in. So let's say we didn't want the poles to move all the way out to the outside when the road went wider. We wanted to move them most of the way. And what we really want for that is to have our own widening range that's just applied to those poles. And we can do that because the widening range component, it basically applies to everything underneath it within the Unity scene graph. So at the moment we've got one component applied to the top level object of our mesh template. But what we can do is we can take that component, and I'll just copy it, and I'll move it onto this top object. I can use paste as new, and then I can delete it. From the top level object. Now you might notice that I've laid out this mesh template with basically a few empty objects so that I can isolate the top part from the bottom part of the mesh template. And sometimes you may need to do that if you want to control where your widening ranges are applied to. So we've got the widening ranges for the top one, and I will add some widening ranges to the bottom one. Now one of the things we can do is we can move, we have this Y value, and I should point out that the Y value is completely for the editor. It doesn't have any effect on how the widening is applied, but it just allows us to move the visual indicators up and down, and that can be helpful so that we can see how it lines visually. Whoops. I can just grab that handle. There we go. So what I can do is I can create a widening range that's actually a little bit wider. That to 3.3 maybe. Mirror it to the left. And maybe I'll set a minimum width as well. Perhaps it'll be 0.2. So now this widening range will apply from this object downwards. It's worth keeping in mind that widening ranges, they do take into account any of the transforms that are applied to the objects. They handle translation, I should say position and scaling very well, but rotation not so well. And that's mainly because it doesn't really, the concept of rotation doesn't really make sense when you're trying to apply it to an object which is basically specifying a range of horizontal values. It's like if you rotate that 90 degrees, that doesn't really mean anything useful anymore. So that's something that should generally be avoided. And if you do find you want to apply ranges to something that has been rotated, it may make sense to create an object higher up in the hierarchy and apply the ranges to that object and have that object without any rotations, and then you can have your rotated object underneath it. So anyway, let's go ahead and update the rest of the track, and let's have a look. So that's how we can use two widening ranges and apply them to different parts of our mesh template. And we could basically use as many as we want, as many as is appropriate. That bit may need a little bit of work. But anyway, that's the basic concept. Now you may be interested in why in this particular type of mesh template, we've got separate boxes at the top of the left and right pole. And a lot of the default ones, we basically have one long beam and both of the poles basically push into the beam. But the reason for that is that the widening logic doesn't support stretching out spaced objects. So anything with a racetrack spaced component on it, it can be moved horizontally in response to how the road has been widened, but it can't be stretched horizontally. And essentially only continuous meshes support being stretched horizontally. So in this case we've just got around it by creating two of these boxes, one for each pole, and just allowing the whole thing to be moved. Okay, so anyway, that's how you can control the width of the racetrack in Racetrack Builder. I hope you can see how this adds a lot of flexibility and opens up possibilities for different types of racetracks. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments, the Racetrack Builder forum, or by email. And once again, thanks for watching.